Welcome to Personality Crisis. I am Dylan Riss, your host for this episode, and I am so pleased to be joined once again. For listeners of the past episode, you'll be pleased to see that González Ormerod is back with us. Alex has previously talked to us about the current state of economics in Mexico. And we wanted to expand the conversation for the uninitiated, largely Anglo audience of Mexico's political transformation over the course of the 21st century, where it dawned with the inauguration of Vicente Fox. It's gone through, some more right-wing governments. We've had the Calderon, the, Piñeta Nieto, administrations. We are now well into a multi-regime Morena regime led by Claudia Sheinbaum. And Alex, for those who haven't heard you speak before, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience, joining us from Mexico City?
Hey there. So yes, I run a publication called the Mexico Political Economist, and it's a publication that covers Mexico for the uninitiated and for experts. So it's all pretty digestible, pretty accessible for anyone, but going very deep into the Mexican political economy. What does that mean? It means politics, it means policy, it means the economics, it means business, and how they all mesh. And I think wonderfully, we had a really lovely conversation about economics. We're going into politics, but I will always say that they're completely linked. And I think we live in a moment right now, which I think we're being told that that's actually the right approach, because for many, many years, the sort of Vincente Fox approach of the early 2000s, this is the Mexican president who came to power in the year 2000, first democratically elected president in the post-free era. And he basically said that the best way to govern a country is like a government, is like a company, and the best way to do that is to get rid of politics and just let the business people do what they want. And it was a disaster, and it's because it turns out politics and the economy are completely enmeshed. And everyone has come to realize that, from the United States to the European Union. They're all looking over at China and saying, oh my God, maybe actually policy, politics, and the economy do have something to contribute to each other.
What are some inflection points in Mexican politics that led to that broader realization? In the U.S., the 21st century has been shaped by things like, in our case, 9/11, the massive recession that began in 07 through 09. Obama's presidency here stoked a lot, and then of course. Trumpism, which has largely dominated since he first got elected in 2016. What are some equivalent inflection points in Mexican politics that have shifted the country's thinking since those early days of Vicente Fox?
So I want to start with something that I'll probably speak less of, because I think it's a fascinating fundamental part of Mexican social fabric and its economy and its politics. But funnily enough, it's not like a 9/11 for us, which is the drug war. The drug war is sort of splat bang right in the middle of this sort of conversation that we're having. It's what Americans know the most about. And yet, funnily enough, even though it's really defined a lot of where you can do business, how you can do business, how Mexicans live and die, it's also, I think, overstated, because it's very much the focus of American attentions. Why? Because you're affected by it, because you run it, basically. It's the drug trade in Mexico exists because of Americans, not only because you consume the vast majority of those drugs, but because you pay for the guns that you can freely buy in the United States to send over down to the United States, to Mexico. That's probably the most interesting thing about the Trump administration this time around, is that then the best thing about it is that they've come to a realization that I think they don't have to play a part anymore. They're the bad guys in their own story to an extent. And I think they've understood that to the extent that they're happy to say that actually they're co-responsible with Mexico. And so you've got Marco Rubio saying we're also at fault for the violence in Mexico, which has never been said by any US government before or after. I mean, before if any party, I mean. And so that's been really fascinating to me. It's a really important part of Mexico. And yet, I think when you look at the reasons that Morena came to power in the year 2018 on a landslide victory, followed by López Obrador handing power to Claudia Sheinbaum on an even bigger landslide victory, people weren't talking about security. Security wasn't the main issue in Mexico. And that was for a very clear reason. The economy was far more important to people. People's livelihoods were far more important to people. That's why they elected a left-wing government. And a sort of sad truth, which is the fact that 50% of the terrible violence in Mexico happens in 5% of one of the 6,000 municipalities in the country. So it means that most of the country, pretty safe, actually. Yucatan Peninsula, safer than anywhere in the United States, actually. 5% of those municipalities are hell on earth. And that's where all the journalists get sent to. That's where all the attention goes to. And rightly so, right? It's unacceptable to have those amounts of violence anywhere. But it's just something to keep in mind, which is like why the needle doesn't get moved around so clearly by the drug war as one would assume, being in Mexico. A clear example was El Mencho. I don't know if you heard of that, Dylan.
No, tell me and tell our audience.
And that's good. It's perfectly. It wasn't a trick question. It's just El Mencho was that big flare-up that we had of violence that you probably heard of a few months ago. El Mencho was that drug cartel leader that they caught and killed.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, killed and caught. I don't know what. Yeah, and basically, the whole country was up in flames, whatever. But actually, very few people died. It was sort of theatrical thing. It was mostly. I mean, I don't want to understate this. A lot of cartel people died, and a lot of military people died in the sort of face-on fight to capture this drug leader. But a lot of it was sort of the dramatic display of power that the cartel wanted to show. This is where we're at. Don't screw with us, whatever. But actually, most Mexicans, even in the state where it happened, which is the state of Jalisco, they were out in the cafes having a nice time. They didn't even realize something was happening. And so people would call me from Ukraine and Palestine and be like, hey, man, are you okay? I'm like, dude, come on. So yeah, that's sort of like the situation with the drug war. What actually mattered in Mexico to every single Mexican, no matter if they were in Mexico City or very safe Yucatan Peninsula, it was the economy. It was the sort of decay of the economy over the years of what we now call neoliberalism. And the reason isn't because I think the people who ran the country were bad. They were pretty good technically, I think. They just believed a doctrine that was very much propaganda, and they understood it to be fact. To such an extent that when Vincente Fox comes to power after 80 years of one-party rule under the PRI, he takes the power sort of in this wave of optimism in the post-Cold War era. It's the end of history. It's the end of the left, really. There's only one thing left, which is good government. I wrote a book recently. It's called La derecha no existe, pero ahí está. The translation broadly is the right. There's no such thing as the right, open brackets, and yet there it is. And it's basically this concept that the Mexican right traditionally has, which is sort of it's sort of summarized in a beautiful way in this wonderful phrase that I got in an interview with a former Fox, Vincente Fox functionary at Spanglish official. And she said to me, darling, I don't know why you're writing this book. There's no such thing as the right. That's a thing the left made up. I'm like, what? So there's such a thing as the left, which is terrible, say the right says, but there's no such thing as the right because that's just good government. That's just common sense. That's just good people. And that's how Vicente Fox ruled the country for 6 years. And it was a disaster because he said the best way to run a country is as a business. And the problem is that he misunderstood Mexican politics. He still worked within this democratic fabric that Mexico had just started using when he was elected, and he was a complete failure. He could get no policy passed. He was just really frustrated. He was a bit like a Donald Trump, sort of less I think less terrifying because he was more of a simpleton, if you can believe it. But
it's a low bar.
Yeah.
Trump is probably the wealthiest simpleton.
Yeah, but this Vicente Fox was like a Coca-Cola company executive. He was a great campaigner, but he didn't get even close to majority. He got back a third of Congress, which really bound his hands. And so he was a massive disappointment. And so what we get is, from then on, we get year after year of right-wing government. We get basically every single version of right-wing government you could imagine. You get the hardcore neoliberal person who doesn't even realize he's neoliberal because he doesn't believe in ideology. He just believes in free markets, which is itself an ideology, but they don't realize it. Then we got 6 years of, actual right-wing government, someone who was a good Catholic. No, Calderón. Felipe Calderón from 2006 to 2012. Remember, terms in Mexico are 6 years and you can't be reelected. And so he, proper. He's the one who starts he's the one who starts the Mexican drug war for many reasons, but I think sort of ideologically because of this very clear idea about authority and the right. The fact that there's no such thing as a right-wing Democrat, which, he believed in democracy. He was a right-winger who believed in democracy. There's no such thing that there's no one above the president in a democratically elected state. And so it's funny how everyone says López Obrador and his terrible policy, hugs and not bullets, which we can discuss in a bit. I have a lot of issues with that definition. But it's like this lefty coming in saying, come on, guys, let's stop killing each other. Well, the right-wing equivalent is, if you don't obey, I will kill you. And that's what he went and did. And that's what triggers the drug war in the year 2006, literally days after he's elected, on a very tenuous, teeny tiny majority. And what was that teeny tiny majority against? It was a man called López Obrador, who was the left-wing candidate and who was ahead in the polls the whole time. And then massive, illegal, sort of retrospectively decided by the electoral authority, illegal campaigns against López Obrador, but that were enough to push him over the edge. A lot of people say it was fraud. I don't think so, in the sense that I don't think they were stuffing ballots into the boxes, but you didn't need fraud because they illegally pushed people into voting against their own interests because of what was like, and this isn't me saying illegal because I don't like it, it was the Electoral Commission said all that ad campaign and all the sort of like sinisterness about the fear campaign that was run by Felipe Calderón was an illegal way of running a campaign. And so we get 6 years of that, which was basically marked by the drug war. And then the country said, screw this. And so this is a really big moment in the Mexican democracy. López Obrador runs again, but he loses pretty definitively by 6 points. Instead of 0.001%, he loses by 6%, not against the PAN, because the people were sick of this right-wing sort of party. Felipe Calderón, Fox before him, they say, screw these guys, they're useless. Let's go back to the devil we know. And so we get 6 more years of the PRI. This is the party that was in power for 80 years, and like your toxic girlfriend, they said, don't worry, I've changed. And of course they hadn't. Of course they hadn't. They come into power touting private investment, and saying we're going to privatize everything. The state is useless because they're a sort of fair weather party. The PRI, they don't believe in anything per se. They just want power, and so they come in embracing the sort of liberal ideology. Remember, this is right after the financial crisis, where it looked like the good guys had won, and that by that I mean the banks that had been bailed out, and everything was fine. Democracy would live on in the sort of liberal sense we'd all gotten used to. And so the 6 years of Peña Nieto go by, and they're a complete disaster. The drug war continues to flare up, in the sort of climax being the kidnap and death and disappearance of the 42 students. So the 43 students in southern Mexico, Ayotzinapa 43, but also the economy doesn't grow. And not only that, all these massive investments that are coming in, most of those proceeds are going into the PRI politicians' pockets. Enormous corruption scandals, like just gargantuan corruption, like really, really terrible. And people said enough. And so people say, everyone loves the left-wing party because Mexicans must be pretty progressive. Not really. Mexicans actually tried every flavor of the right before saying, screw it, we're going for the hard left. But this is an interesting hard left. In the year 2008, what happens is López Obrador, after trying three times to get to power, wins a big landslide. He wins over 50%. There's no second round in Mexico as in other Latin American countries. He wins 50% first time round, bang, big majority. He's defeated everyone pretty decisively. But he's a different sort of person. I wouldn't even say he's a progressive per se. he's an interesting flip on what Americans specifically would define as left wing. Because what does, like, we'll do the straw man. What does a Democrat look like? You know, like a sort of like Gavin Newsom Democrat. He loves the sort of look and feel of progressivism. Like, he's happy to talk about diversity and, like, you know, like democracy, all that. But like, he's really into all the different identities, right? Like, you know, all the identities except for probably the most crucial one if you're a leftist, which is class. Democrats in America never want to touch class unless they're a sort of Bernie Sanders Mamdani Democrat, and that's why they hate them. That's the identity that they never want you to touch because that scares off the investors and the donors. López Obrador is the anti-democrat, the, you know, big D Democrat in that sense, in the sense that he's actually a pretty conservative guy socially. He's not anti, you know, trans or LGBTQ, but he's not out there fighting for their rights. He's not anti-women, clearly, but like he wasn't a sort of anti-sexist, you know, actively. What he was a classic left-winger who said the biggest issue that people faced is their day-to-day affordability crisis, very much on the basis of what Mayor Mamdani sort of ran on. And so he wins this election. And I don't know if, for all those folks who didn't listen to it, our first episode was about why Morena is so popular. And it's basically, there's lots of different reasons people give. It's actually just one reason. López Obrador doubled the minimum wage after 30 years of complete, like, people don't understand this. Imagine having the same wage you had in the 1980s today. That's where Mexico was at. Like, that's how bad it got. I wrote this for a French publication who wanted me to write about Mexico for them, and they literally couldn't believe me. They said, I need you to give me the stats for this because this seems impossible. And I gave them the official Mexican stats. They couldn't believe it, right? Because they kept wages low because that was apparently what was supposed to keep Mexico competitive. Wasn't true at all, actually. So he doubles the minimum wage. That, you know, rising tide raises all boats. It's called the lighthouse effect. And it means that even non-minimum wages also went up. And so people could spend more. That drove the economy. Turns out even folks like Carlos Slim and big Walmart did better because people were buying more stuff. So the Mexican economy was buoyed. But inflation, investment went down because the rich didn't like the way that the Morena government was approaching the economy. A sort of classic case for this was the airport, a massive sort of like Dubai-style airport. It was supposed to be the like Western Hemisphere's like airport hub, and it was sort of built under this onus of enormous corruption by the Peña Nieto regime, which really made people hate it. And so López Obrador came in and cancelled it, which was also a massive mistake. Because instead of saying, well, screw it, let's just finish the airport, even though we spent billions of dollars on it when it was supposed to be worth way less, he said, this is a terrible symbol, we're going to cancel it. And it completely spooked investors because they said, oh, wow, this is the sort of guy this is. And he did it, I think, also in a pretty bad way. He did it in a sort of botched consulta, in a box. When you go out to the polls and people vote for something, it's called a referendum.
A referendum. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no. Okay. And so he did he did a pretty crappy referendum. Very few people voted because it felt like a sham. I think it probably was a sham. And you know, everyone said, "Yeah, we hate the airport." And so it completely spooked investors. And people sort of like investors have long memories when it comes to grudges. They've stuck to that ever since. And so you've got an interesting situation where Morena won again in the year 2004 under Claudia Sheinbaum, 24. In part because of massive popularity, in part because the opposition is in complete shambles. Mexico is one of the few places in the world without not even the far right, but no right at all. The right is pretty much inexistent at the moment as a political opposition in the official sense because they can't get their act together because they're still infighting. It's actually a lot like the Democrats right now in the United States. And so that's more or less where we're at now, where a very strong Morena government with a very strong president, a complete supermajority in Congress, friendly court system. We can talk about the courts in a sec. And more or less broad support. It's going down, the support. But Morena's very firmly in control, and yet the economy isn't growing. And that's what their entire project is based off. And so we're sort of at a crucial moment at this moment.
Well, some of the ways that you describe the López Obrador administration, it in the U.S. it might recall a little bit of like a New Deal Democrat, people who were economically
Yeah.
looking out for the worker, raising wages, but not as socially progressive. It's some of the in the U.S. this would be voters who, for example, in Western Pennsylvania, who used to reliably vote Democratic and then moved
Yeah.
quickly to Trump, sometimes over social issues or xenophobia. How would, for our audience, how has Sheinbaum distinguished herself? Because I think she has in many ways, and maybe not been quite the one-for-one continuation of her predecessor that some would think. What should our audience know about how she's carved out her own lane?
I think she is very different. Fortunately, I think she's got the right positive aspects from her predecessor, the sort of focus on people's well-being, focus on the poor. I think that's great. But also I think she's a more worldly politician. I don't want to sound condescending, but I think it's true. I think there was a big issue with López Obrador in which the sense that he did feel like he was stuck in the 1970s. To him, the highest tech industry was oil. And like everything else could be done sort of like pony and buggy style stuff. And that's just simply not where we can be at in the age of AI. Whether you love it or not, you sort of have to carve your place in it, whether it's in the resistance like the Catholic Church has, or in favor of it with the techno-fascists. But you've got to sort of address it. López Obrador had no clue. We probably never heard of AI. And so Claudia Sheinbaum is a far more worldly person. She's a far more academic person. And I think, interestingly, she's sort of driven by data. This is good and bad. I think it makes her sort of dependent on other people and sort of makes her government, I don't know if slower, but maybe that's a good thing, but maybe not so much in fast-moving times. But also it makes her data-based. I think she's a scientist, and she moves on the basis of evidence. That means that she's governed in a very different way. When it comes to security, she's done an interesting thing, which is she's gone probably the most different way possible from her predecessor, López Obrador, in the sense that before López Obrador said, we're not going to do this full frontal war anymore, and we're going to address crime on its roots, which I think is very clever, right? Which is, how do you get people out of the hands of criminals? How do you stop them from being recruited by them? You give out social programs to the young in rural areas. You give subsidies to poor farmers, that sort of stuff. You stop people from being drawn into the narco economy. The issue is the genie was already out of the bottle by then. The drug war was already on. Remember that the drug war isn't a war between the state and a cartel. My biggest pet peeve in the US is when people say the cartel. There is no the cartel. There's a sort of like churning treadmill of lots of different sizes, of different criminal organizations that do different things and have different leadership styles, etc. It's like saying, it's a bit like saying the economy or the business when you mean the entire US economy. There's different businesses, there's different companies with different styles, whatever. And a lot of the war is between them because the fragmentation of the cartels through the cartel war initially meant that you had them splintering and fighting each other. And so the genie's out of the bottle. You can't just say, let's look after people and then they'll stop recruiting. They're already out there fighting and killing people. And so Claudia Sheinbaum's gone out pretty gung-ho. She's out there killing, drug lords in the streets, which was something we saw before. But that's not the way she's actually focusing on the drug war. She's actually focusing on a very different way. And I think a way that's really interesting. It's a way that I admire. I think it's actually a way that we might see an end to this conflict to an extent, but it also kind of scares me, which is she's going down the intelligence route. She's a database woman. She wants data to run this. And so she's creating an enormous intelligence network in which she's able to trace, hopefully, the drug flow, the money flows for the drugs, to cut off that lifeblood before they're even able to pay the kid on the street or to buy that drug in the US. And so strangle them on that end, sort of like that economic warfare rather than actual warfare on the streets. The issue is this requires a massive espionage apparatus that maybe you trust Claudia Sheinbaum with it, but would you trust Peña Nieto with it? Would you trust a Donald Trump with it? And so that's a really scary sort of thing. But it's also, Mexico's in a situation where we've had 20 years of war. We've got hundreds of thousands of dead at this point, I think people are starting to be willing to take bets on those sort of more dangerous things simply because they want to see this war over.
Well, one group that's been involved in this is the American CIA, and that's been in the news recently. That the governor of Chihuahua was collaborating with the CIA, and there have been other sort of revelations of CIA operations in Mexico coordinating with the government. What are your thoughts on that?
There's the performativity of it and then the actual facts of it. I think Mexican law is very clear. You're not allowed to have any foreign agents in Mexico without permission from the president. The governor of Chihuahua didn't have it. She broke the law. That's clear enough. I think that's very, very clear at this point. But that's clearly that's clearly not what Morena's focused on. They're focused on the politics. Chihuahua is an opposition state run by the PAN, the party that gave us Vicente Fox and Calderon. And they want her out. They want that state. And so they've really hammed it up, I think, not to great effect, and also to an extent against their own interests. They've really gone out and said she's a traitor, and let's bring her in to declare before Congress and all of that. It's funny because I think ultimately, even though she's technically allowed to, she's making a big fuss about how she's broken sovereignty of Mexico. And so instead of leaning into you broke the law because you should have consulted me, she's leaning into she's a traitor because she's working with the Americans. Whereas I'm pretty sure in 50 years' time, when we open the Trump papers instead of the Kennedy papers, we're going to find that Claudia Sheinbaum was working very closely with the U.S. intelligence. Why? Because U.S. intelligence is actually very, very good at finding the stuff that Claudia Sheinbaum needs to find. A lot of the arrests, the big drug lords, the government has openly said they depended on US espionage for that, which means it probably goes way deeper. And also, the reason I mentioned the Kennedy files is because back in the age of the PRI, the 1960s, amidst the Cold War, the biggest sort of like accusation you could make against someone wasn't you're a communist, it's you're a CIA agent. If you criticize the government, you're like, oh, you're a bloody CIA agent. And guess what? They opened up the papers. Do you know who was the top CIA agent in Mexico during the 1960s? It was the Mexican president. The Mexican president was the top CIA agent in Mexico at the time, and it wasn't even the CIA who sought out the president and installed him. The Mexican president realized that was a really good way of getting stuff done, getting the US on side, getting tools of like espionage, getting weapons, and so they volunteered. And so maybe they're not as cynical as that, but I know that they're working with US intelligence, so it feels annoying to me and counterproductive for them to really lean into that.
They seem to, at least on the surface, like one another more than either their political bases would like. And maybe that's performative. Maybe it's purely pragmatic on her side because it's well known that if you want anything from Trump, flatter him on a personal level. But, perhaps as world leaders, they share some bond that the rest of us don't understand.
Exactly right.
What I want to conclude with here is you had teed up the role of the courts, and how they have shaped what Morena has been able or not been able to do, and I'd love for you to educate us about the role that courts currently play in Mexico.
So investors will often go on about this very abstract concept, which is uncertainty. Why don't you invest? Uncertainty. I'd rather know if the house is going to burn down, I'd actually rather it burn down and then I can invest rather than, waiting for it to come down because it smells of gas. They smell gas in the air. Part of it was that airport, but a lot more of it now is the court system. Why is that? A couple of years ago when Claudia won, the big thing wasn't so much that she won. The biggest thing was that Morena got a supermajority in Congress, if you count their parliamentary allies. This was massive because it means they can change the constitution without having to bring on any external people. And they did a lot of stuff. They passed a lot of laws, but the biggest law was the judicial reform. Now, Mexico's judicial system is very convoluted, but it's also pretty hated. Justice, as we well know, in Mexico is almost never served, like 98% impunity rate. The issue is they sort of focused in on, I think, the feelings and not so much what could actually be fixed. And so what they did was they said the issue that the courts have is that we don't have enough democracy. And so what they said is, instead of having this professional system of judges and magistrates, very similar to the one you've got in the US, we're going to have an elected system in which, a bit like, you know, the local sheriff or whatever, we're going to elect every single judicial position in the country, from your local magistrate to the top president of the Supreme Court. And it's been a disaster. I think it's been a disaster also for people who kind of like the idea. More democracy does sound good, just the way Morena did it, forcing it through, doing it through the most corrupt people possible to force it through Congress, and then really not even clearly reading through what was going to be a really delicate document, because they wanted to push this massive package of reforms through. And so what we ended up with was this turd of a reform that we now have to live with. And it's so bad that they're now sort of trying to roll it back as we speak, but without completely getting rid of it. And so the investors see that and they say, well, there's two scenarios and they're both terrible. Scenario number one is a sort of scary boogeyman left-wing scenario, which is people have gone out with a list of like who they need to vote for. Very, very low turnout in the judicial elections because it was just impossible to know who to vote for. It was lists of hundreds of people that you had to sort of know who you were going to vote for, from the Supreme Court justices to like the lowest magistrates. You needed to have a very clear idea, if you were going to educate yourself about this, about who these 100 people were, and have 26 people or so in your mind to vote. And so people had no idea. People don't have the time to do this. People always say, oh, you're so condescending. The Mexican people are very clever. The Mexican people have better things to do. Like in the same way that I'm pretty sure you don't understand fertilizers, but I don't need you to understand fertilizers because that's the farmer's job. But the farmer probably doesn't have time to sit down and spend 15 hours like you have, like talking head on a TV show, to read through the profiles of thousands of bureaucrats. And so nobody turned out to vote except for the Morena party machinery. And so they duly elected every single pro-Morena judge, which completely spooked everyone, including the investors. And funnily enough, I think some of them have been pretty independent. A lot of them have been accused of working with the cartels, which is also worrying because, again, they forced through the reform without really having any checks and balances for who gets to be a person who runs. And so a lot of the it was literally like it was so obvious as well. Stuff like El Chapo's lawyer and stuff like that, like just insanely clear. And so it's just been a complete disaster. It's been a complete cock up. I think it's made a mockery, not of the justice system. I don't think people love the justice system. It's made a mockery of the fact that Morena is to be considered a serious political force. And I think it is. On lots of senses, it's been really good. Security, the economy. But I think this was just a massive Titanic cock-up that they did out of hubris. They had this supermajority, and I think they were high on their own supply. And so they said, screw the opposition, we're not even going to have a debate. And they didn't have a debate. They literally passed it without reading the friggin' reform. And now we have to live with it. And it's insane.
Is there any talk of rescinding this and going back to the old system? So
if, they're doing it in dribs and drabs, you've got a sort of counter-reform proposed by Morena that they're now very diligently discussing in Congress, which is sort of like adding, because they don't want to accept they were wrong. So we're going to continue to have elections, but maybe this time, hopefully we'll have enough time and resources so that it's not El Chapo's lawyer becoming like the local magistrate. And so dribs and drabs. I mean, it's a process. They wanted to be revolutionary. I commend them for that. They said, let's have radical reform that really democratizes the system. But the issue is, without the proper checks and balances, without facilitating this sort of thing to the people, you're not really doing democracy. What you're doing is you're doing electoral sort of politicking, in which really it's a bit like the sort of like we talk about democracy in the US, and yet we've got a bunch of delegates doing a lot of dodgy stuff behind the scenes. It feels very similar.
Sadly, in the courts as well, and a lot of state courts are elected. The judges are elected, and so even though in the federal system there is some checks and balances with nominations and confirmations, a lot of state and municipal judges are elected, and yes, it rarely goes well.
So yeah,
Well,
it's a shame.
yes. Well, this has been wonderful. It really, it just, for speaking for myself, it just makes me want to learn more. And fortunately for those who want to learn more, Alex has a remarkable website, the Mexico Political Economist, mxpe.org. Right now, some of the headlines, the lead story: "No dollar is worth the same." Comparing Mexico's top sources of foreign currency. We got the Mexico First policy shines through in the new EU trade deal. We got a provocative one from the in the archives. Claudia Sheinbaum is losing control, so that's a click right there. So anyway, you should definitely check out mxpe.org for English language coverage of Mexican politics and economics. Alex, you are a wonderful guest,
Thank you.
would love to hope to continue the conversation down the line.
Thank you. If you want another punchy headline, Mexico
Yes.
and the CIA, a love story. That's a couple of weeks back.
That's a must read. I think, right there.
Yeah.
So check out all those stories and more at mxpe.org. Alex, thank you so much for joining us on Personality Crisis, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you so much, Dylan. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you.